New look, let's go. Hello and welcome back for another podcast episode of Aceto Magazine. I'm your host, Emre Şentürk, and founder of Aceto Magazine, and I'm back with a brand new, very brand new episode of this podcast. As you can see, for all of you who follow me on YouTube, unfortunately, all of you who listen to me on podcasts or podcast providers cannot see it, but I have rearranged the setting a little bit, and I hope you like it. But be sure the content is going to stay the same, remain the same at the high quality that I aim to achieve and also improve. Today I have a very special episode for all of you because I'm going to present to you a new concept of political categorization, and it is called the political cube. Now, as you might know from many articles I've wrote before, is that I'm very ambitious in terms of thinking about new concepts and how to develop political science a bit further, thinking about new concepts, and most prominently the Ataturk paradox, right? And I'm going to put the link down below. Was one of the main inventions and innovations that I brought to the field of political science. And obviously I aim to continue to do that. And most recently, I developed a concept that is better suited to kind of develop or to categorize political thinking and policy making, as well as policy actions, etc., etc. So in this concept, I kind of take what is already there, what we know from political categorizations, and develop it further. And I have an article where this is also described in detail. Obviously, link is also in the description, so you can read this article also after this show or after this episode. So there it is in a bit more detail. But what does it entail? How does it work? What is the political cube? So in order to understand that, we first of all have to think about what we currently use to kind of categorize political thinking. And unfortunately, most of our political thinking is today limited to two realms, which is the left and the right. So we always tend to think in terms of left and right. The leftists did this, the rightists or the political right did this. So we have a very limited understanding of how politics works and what we can use to categorize actually the developments that we encounter on a daily basis. So it is not very powerful, right? If you just have two sides and you just have to pick one in order to categorize, okay, well, this policy action is left and this is right. So we have the political spectrum. This is was developed by Hans Eysenck, I hope I pronounced it correctly. Very important addition to the field of political science. He actually added another dimension to it. So we have this one-dimensional scope, right, of left and right political thinking, and he brought it to the next level in adding democratic and authoritarian on an y-axis, meaning that we don't have just an x-axis, but also a y-axis in terms of democratic and authoritarian. The terms are quite problematic because on the left, what does left mean? You know, I go to the left, I go to the right, but what does it mean in political terms? Obviously, we often associate things with it, but there's a reason for it. And because I think this is not very powerful, we should rather think about left political thinking in terms of very redistributive political actions, meaning taking from one part of the population and giving it to the other, and rightist redistributive. And in that sense, that politics is not really engaged in kind of redistributing resources and reallocating them among the society. So this is a better terminology to use here. But nonetheless, this is the basis. And then the two points that this gentleman named Hans Eysenck basically introduced. Democratic, also very difficult. Democratic has a very different meaning in technocratic terms, so we just call it libertarian, so more free, yeah, non-restrictive. And on the other side, we have authoritarian, which actually is a good term because it implies control and kind of, yeah, keeping everything under control. So we have these two axes, right? Left, right, authoritarian and libertarian. But this is also not enough, because in the end we just have 4 categories where we can place those ideas and policy making terms and so on and so forth. So it's not very useful. And also we are 3-dimensional organisms. We think in 3 dimensions. We live in 3 dimensions. Everything we do is based on the idea that we have 3 dimensions. And this is lacking in political science terms. And this was the basis of my thinking, because left and right obviously is not sufficient, because we have 2 options to place political topics into. All right, we have another axis, we have now 4, but we also have to double it again. And by adding a z-axis, we have the possibility to also open up the discourse and categorize political courses of action on 3 different axes. Not only left, right, libertarian, authoritarian, but also in 2 other terms, the 3rd dimension. And this is what the political cube is, and what the invention that I explain in this article is. And now you're obviously curious, what are those? Well, on the one end of this 3rd dimension is the aspect of emotional, or emotionality, whatever you want to call it. It's the idea that policy making is driven by emotional motives and arguments. Meaning, if you would say, as a politician, I want to raise taxes because I think this and that is not fair. The argument is not an empiric or technocratic one, it is an emotional one. If a politician says, I want all the foreigners out of my country because this is our country, the argument and the motives and the drivers behind this policy action are not rational, but they're emotional. They are not grounded in an argumentative structure that can be justified and also carried by political science. On the other side, we have on this dimensional 3-dimensional axis, we have technocratic, or technocratic thinking, whatever you call it. Technocratic is the term, or the way I put it in the article. And this means that policy making is grounded in and based on empiric facts, on technicalities, on kind of the rationality of political science. Because we can take those arguments again and say, I want to raise taxes because I think, or not I think, that again would be emotional, but I want to raise taxes because by taxing those groups in society, we want to gain more revenue in order to reinvest it in those groups. For example, rational argument, technically correct. Obviously, if it's done in this way or not, this is another question. It's just about the categorization of this policy action. So this gives us a more accurate picture of where to place this policy action. And then we can turn back to this foreigner argument and say, well, I want all foreigners out because I don't want the societal structure to become more diversified, in order for us to concentrate on the intercultural aspects that we have, or intracultural aspects that we seem to have lost over time, and regain them, and then we obviously want the foreigners to be out. Rational argument, justifiable, and technically correct, basically. Now, why is it important that we have such a or more sophisticated way of categorizing policy directions and policy making, but also political ideas? As you might know, or as I introduced or said in the beginning, it is kind of a problem when we just have very limited options in order to put labels on people, right? When we have left and right, there are many things that we associate with those terms, politically seen, that actually have no connection with the word itself or with what we want to explain there. When we say left, we think about feminism, we think about democracy, we think about fairness, we think about welfare, we think about healthcare, social justice movement, we think about all sorts of things, or many other concepts. We think about the West, we think about Europe, we think about the northern hemisphere, we think about white people. These are all associations that we connect with just one word, and these are highly complex concepts. Basically, if we take the concept of democracy, and this is distinct from democratic thinking even, and put it behind a word that's called left, and there are 10 other concepts that are highly complex, and we put it behind one word, the simplification that happens there reduces the importance of all the other terms that lay behind it. And then obviously the meaning becomes distorted. And when it becomes distorted, technical and productive dialogue is not possible anymore. And when it's not possible, we cannot progress in those fields, and political science especially. And the same goes for right, because when we think about the right, we think about capitalism, we think about money, we think about conservatism, we think about racism, we think about all sorts of things. We think about the color blue, because this is something that we would associate with all the points that I just mentioned, the military, police, all things that belong to the right thinking. But there again, we are simplifying very complex concepts that lie behind it, and in the end, we're just harming ourselves because our understanding becomes so limited. And then the concepts that lay under this umbrella or below this umbrella term become meaningless and useless. And in the end, when I say, for example, conservatism, very complex thinking and concept in its entirety, becomes just a buzzword, basically. Same goes for libertarian and authoritarian. If you think about authoritarian, it's just it's purely dictatorship or other forms of one-man rule. And obviously this is also not right. So we need more differentiation. And by adding this third dimension to it, those concepts do not need to borrow from or don't need to rely on only one word to be represented within that whole categorization process of political thinking. They have more options. Democracy can assume more forms in a three-dimensional room than on a one-dimensional axis. And then democracy gets the opportunity to become or get the value that it actually has by assuming those different forms. Democracies can come in so many different forms, but you need to locate them. And if you don't have the tools to locate them, it becomes just one way of thinking about democracies, and then it cannot unfold its true power. And this is very important, why we need the cognitive tools to kind of categorize all these things. And I think the third axis is very, very important in that regard, and it helps to categorize those those aspects, right? And then also when we think about policy making, we need to also understand how policy actions are kind of informed, in what they want to do and where they come from, background wise. So I would turn back to the example of the politician who says, I want to raise or lower taxes. If that happens to be born out of a technocratic setting, which is inherently better than emotional, it means that this taxation policy is more likely to succeed rather than with an emotional background, depending on the context, obviously. But we need to locate it in order to make sense of it. If the context, if we are in a very rational context, political context, and there's an emotionally driven policy proposal or a policy action, this might be calculated and born out of a rationality that in the end helps to be efficient in the end. Yeah, there are many different variations of that. But if it's the other way around, for example, technical policy actions might not be very fruitful in very emotional contexts. So it pretty much depends, but we need to analyze it and then locate it within this cube. And without the cube, we just have basically nothing, and then we just use it to put labels on people. You are a conservatist, you are a leftist, you are a feminist, you are this, you are that. And in the end, we don't reach common sense and a mode where discourse is going to be useful. So the political cube, I think, is a very useful and very important addition to political science. I put a lot of thought into it, and I think also in the context of DEVLETism, so the concept like the state thinking or the state theory that I developed in my book, which by the way is also linked in the description. It is very important because this technocratic element, we have lost it in political science and also in politics generally, which is very sad. And it does not help us because in the end we have such emotionally loaded policy actions in a lot of countries that we might not think about the other technical ways that we can go and kind of explore. So we need this cube in order to locate it. And over time, if you start, for example, collecting data on it and place policy actions within a country within that cube, you quickly see how imbalanced some countries are or not. And according to that, you can counterbalance it, because an over-rationality is also not very efficient in the end, because you also need this emotional aspect in order to keep the society together. And in a lot of situations, it makes perfect sense to have this emotionally driven approach to certain things. But not having it and just differentiating between left, right, and libertarian and authoritarian is very limited in what it tells you about policy actions. So, for example, what can we conclude? For example, we can take the European Union, and then we can take China, for example. So if we look at the European Union and we look at China, you would say basically it is these are it is a stark contrast between those two political systems, right? The EU and China. You wouldn't put them together and look for similarities, right? And on the two-dimensional axis, you're perfectly right, they are somewhat kind of far away in terms of authoritarian and libertarian. You might argue that they're both leftist. Some would argue that China or the European Union might be more on the right, but these are kind of argumentative or discursive differences that we have here. But what those two political systems have in common is that they are very, very technocratic. And this is a commonality, together with this being left or more redistributive, shows that those political systems have much more in common, but can be completely different over just one factor, and that would be the amount of control that the government has. So left, why is the European Union left and China left? They redistribute economic sources, but also societal sources and reproductive sources. They reallocate them within their societies and political systems quite not only frequently, but also in a very, how can I say it, in a very significant way. From the bottom to the top, horizontally and whatever. So very redistributive. So in order to kind of balance out social and economic differences. Okay. On the other hand, they're very technocratic. The European Union especially has this mindset or this institutional setup that the experts that work there at the European Commission, they are truly experts in what they're doing and nobody's interfering. They set the standards far away from the national interest, so they have like an own organizational or superseding interest, and according to that, whatever the European Union says it does, the member states in most cases need to apply it and integrate it into national law. In China, it's basically the same thing. So the political party, the only one that exists there, makes decisions based purely on what they think is the best way to go. And then they also obviously consider the nation as a whole. So the European Union has this aim of the great Europe and is making technocratic decisions based on that. And China does that with its own country and its own political system because they want to advance as a unit. In the United States, you don't have, for example, this technocratic element. They are very emotional. There are stark or grave rifts in the society, and the political discussion and argument and policy making is very impulsive. It's very emotionally driven. Turning back to Europe and China, the only thing that separates those two countries is the amount of control that the political elites have over the population. In China, there's full control. In Europe, there's little to no control. They can lead and guide the populations. Obviously, they can also exercise control, but not in that rigid and drastic way it is in China, for example. So basically, the cube helps us here to think about political systems, ideas, policy making, and everything that needs kind of a location and coordinates within the discourse can be picked up here and also can be categorized here. Therefore, it is a very important addition to political science. And as I said, you can read it in full length down below, isido.com. I'm happy when you visit and browse through all the articles. But also, as I said, you can follow me on social media, YouTube, but also on various podcast platforms. And I hope that you enjoyed this episode again. And as I said, very special to me to present this whole new concept to you. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope there's going to be some dialogue, and I'm very curious about your remarks and your comments. So drop some comments down below, as well as a like if you agree. And then see you or hear you next time for another podcast episode of Isido Magazine. So take care and bye.